everyone, and welcome to Seed Speaks. This is a video series brought to you by Seed World Group. My name is Rebecca Carmely Peslak, and I am the digital media producer for Seed World Group. Today, we are talking about preparing for the future of weather with seed banks. Have you ever wondered how the world of agriculture and the seed sector is preparing for the future? Weather is really unpredictable and offers us a reminder on how unprepared we can be in emergency situations. One way the agriculture and seed sectors are preparing to face wild weather is through seed banks. What is a seed bank and how can it help us continue to feed the growing world? Let's dive into it. Today, I am joined by three experts to discuss the future with wild weather and seed banks. Peter Giovannini, project coordinator at Crop Trust, Anna Palme, senior scientist at Nordgen, and Christina Walters, lead scientist at USDA ARS National Laboratory for Genetic Resources Preservation. Peter, Anna, and Christina, thank you so much for joining me today and bringing your expertise onto Seed Speaks. Peter, could you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Hi, thank you. My name is Peter Giovannini. I work for the Crop Trust, and as you said, I'm coordinating a project on streaming global crop conservation strategies. And shortly, the Crop Trust is an international organization devoted to support gene banks around the world. In the sense of supporting this so-called global system for ex situ conservation that includes seed banks and other way of conserving plant genetic resources.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Peter. Anna, could you also introduce yourself, please?
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. So my name is Anna Palme. I'm a biologist with a PhD in genetics from Uppsala University in Sweden. Earlier, I worked a lot with research. I've been mainly using genetic markers to understand questions regarding evolution and ecology. And I've studied speciation history, hybridization, population structure, and migration patterns. But for the last 12 years, I've been working at Nordgen as a senior scientist. And today, my main responsibility is conservation of Nordic crop wild relatives, but I also work on other topics connected to conservation and use. And Nordgen, it's short for the Nordic Genetic Resource Center, and it's a gene bank and a knowledge center. And we work with all the Nordic countries. So Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark are included in our mandate. And we have the responsibility to conserve seed propagated crops and their wild relatives for all the Nordic countries, and have about 30,000 unique seed samples in our collection. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. Christina, could you also introduce yourself to our audience, please?
Hi, everyone. I'm Christina Walters, and I come to you from Fort Collins, Colorado, which is the site of USDA's base seed bank, gene bank for the world for crops, or for the United States for crop genetic resources. Here we have about 600,000 accessions. An accession is usually a bag of seeds and representing about 12,000 species. And my major responsibility is to make sure that those seeds stay alive and are stored in the best possible way.
Awesome. Christina, I'm actually going to start with you for my first question. What is a seed bank or a gene bank, and what is their purpose?
I like that question. Well, I like to think that seed banks are like libraries, and they can each accession is what we call it, which is a bag of seeds, is like a book, and that contains genetic information that helps with agriculture. It may help with resistance to cold. It may help with drought. It may help with a disease. And so we maintain this library so that it's used.
Awesome. Anna, Peter, anything to add on what seed and gene banks are and their purpose?
Yeah, I think it's useful for the general public maybe to think of conserving seeds as living beings. So you have seeds that are alive in gene banks, and you have all a process and methods to keep them alive as long as possible, and then to make them available to potential users. Then, depending of the purpose of the seed bank, you can have users more towards conservation, and that would be, for example, the case of seed bank devoted to wild plants. But you also have seed banks that are focused on crops, and then the use is more towards plant breeding and research towards developing new crop varieties, for example.
Awesome. Anna, did you want to add anything there?
I think we heard a very good description of seed banks, and I would also try to emphasize that it's both conservation and use that's important. I mean, we want to conserve for the future, but we also want to make sure that the material is used by a wide range of users.
Great. And Anna, my next question, how many of these banks are there worldwide, and are they all known about by the public? Are they all accessible to the public?
Okay, so that might sound like a rather easy question, but it's not really. This is because, I mean, there's really a large number of gene banks around the world, and they occur on all the main continents in many, many countries, and they occur in many forms, and some are very small, and some are large, and some are known about around the world, and some are very unknown. So it's a bit of a challenge to count them all, and sometimes also define what exactly do you count as a gene bank or a seed bank, what's large enough, what's rather a small collection perhaps of seeds. I think the best estimate we have is from FAO, so that's the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and they made an estimate quite some years ago now that there's about 1,750 gene banks.
Wow.
I think that's there's at least so many gene banks, so a lot. Of these, maybe 130 is larger and have collections about maybe 10,000 accessions, and then there's a lot of smaller ones as well.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that with us. Peter, Christina, did you want to add anything there?
Maybe I may just add on what she mentioned it, that at the end depends really what you consider as a seed bank, because you can go from considering a single refrigerated box as a seed bank to a full-fledged state-of-the-art building with all the facilities. So it really depends. And you will also have community seed banks around the world. So it depends. But the number I came across is the same that my colleague also mentioned.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Christina?
I agree with what's been said, and the FAO estimate of about 1750. Within the United States, we have a number of different types and different levels of seed banks. A lot of botanic gardens have seed banks that they're collecting native wilds. And it's not just seeds that we preserve, also shoot cuttings and all kinds of germplasm, as well as pollen, which would be what the animal people, they preserve semen, so that would be the counterpart. So it's not just seeds, it's many forms of plants.
Interesting. Thanks for sharing that. Peter, my next question is going to go to you. What type, it kind of plays off of what Christina just said, but what type of seeds go into the banks?
Okay. So generally, you can distinguish different type of seeds according to how well they store in seed banks. Yeah, and that usually depends of how well they can dry. They can be dried. Yeah, so you can have seeds that tolerate well desiccation, and then they can store really well for a long time when put in cold storage after being dried. And these are called orthodox seeds. And then you have seeds that don't tolerate desiccation, and then it's more problematic to conserve them. You have to use other methods. And then, because it's a kind of sort of continuum across these two, you have also seeds that are so-called intermediate. Yeah, so that they tolerate some degree of desiccation, but not as much as the so-called orthodox seeds, and they can survive between 1 and 5 years in cold storage in the gene banks. So that's generally the sort of categorization that is done. I think Christina Waters could talk a lot about this, because she's really an expert on this. I've seen a lot of her work on this. So.
Awesome. Well, Christina, anything to add?
Yeah, this is part of the excitement of the research that I do, and also the facilities that we have here at NLGRP. We're very interested in what Peter introduced as intermediate seeds. And as he said, they really don't store very well in the gene bank by what we would call conventional storage, which is in the freezer, so at a minus 20 degrees centigrade. But they store great in liquid nitrogen. And so some seeds like papaya, many citrus, a lot of our nut crops would all follow into, a lot of palm trees would all fit into this category of intermediate. And a good portion of my research career has been to develop ways to preserve them. So I'm pretty excited that we have that.
Awesome. And Anna, did you want to add anything? I don't know if you could maybe speak to some of the wild relatives that are in the seed banks.
I think this has been very well covered by my colleagues here. A lot of the wild relatives are orthodox, and are especially, at least those from the Nordic countries that I know about. And so we are lucky in that way, because they are easy to store, and as long as the seeds are orthodox, it's much easier to store them and much cheaper. As you heard from Christina now, that there's lots of different approaches, and you can store things in liquid nitrogen and in vitro and so on. But that's always more expensive. So we try to store as much as we can as seeds.
Awesome. So my next question is for anybody to start. What role do seed banks have in an emergency? Do they contribute to emergency preparedness, and can they be called upon in times of need?
Well, Becca, I'd like to point out that seed banks are doing their job right now, not just for the future, but the present. If you look at yields for crops in World Bank statistics, you see an increasing yield since the 1960s, when the Green Revolution started. And for all of our gene banks, there's a constant withdrawal of material for use. That's why we do it. We don't put seeds in the seed bank just for them to stay frozen. It's a constant use. And that's something that we're all really proud about, and we all work together to make sure that the material is available and used now.
Awesome. That's so great to know that we're using these resources in current times. Peter, Anna, anything to add?
So I can think of the two type of emergencies, as you just mentioned, a general emergency. Well, we have environmental, natural catastrophes. Then we have human-caused emergencies. And at the end, in both cases, gene banks and seed banks are useful. Human-caused disasters. You can think of the war in Syria, for example. In that occasion, a major gene bank was lost, which was fundamental for agriculture and plant breeding. But because there is the seed bank in Svalbard that had safety duplicate for the gene bank, that could have been all the material that was conserved in the gene bank that was destroyed. It could have been restored. Yeah, and that's one example of human-caused emergency. In the case of natural catastrophes as well, depending on the type of problem, but you also have example of useful the possibility of withdrawing seeds from that were deposited or that were conserved in seed banks and being used to restore whatever was the problem, to restart planting and so on. I think there's a good example with yams in the Pacific after natural disaster few years ago, for example.
Interesting. Thank you so much. And Anna?
Yeah, I think that gene banks have a really important role when it comes to emergencies. I mean, we've heard now about Svalbard. It's been really important, the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. But I think about gene banks conserving genetic diversity, and that's needed in, for example, in the context of climate change. There's a lot of variation needed to adapt our crops to the new conditions under climate change. And I mean, this is a man-made emergency, and traits such as drought tolerance, for example, that's increasingly thought to be needed in the future, and that's found in diversity conserved in gene banks. For example, in rice and barley, this trait has been found in close relatives, and that's been used in plant breeding to produce more drought-tolerant crops. So that's an example of an emergency where the diversity in genetic resources was very important. Another case could be when a new disease occurs in a crop, and if the modern varieties are not really adapted to this, there's no disease resistance. This can often be found in different types of genetic resources like land races or crop wild relatives. And this has been found again and again in different crops, like resistance to potato blight or stem rust in wheat and so on. So this is an important role for gene banks to provide this diversity. And as Christina said, this is already happening and have been happening for some time, but probably will be increasingly important in the future.
Well, since you touched on diversity, I'm actually going to take an audience question now. Amy asked, how do seed banks contribute to the preservation of genetic diversity, particularly in the face of climate change and agricultural shifts? And anyone can feel free to start this one off.
I'll take a slug at it. So at our I think the key word there is genetic diversity. And in our gene bank, we concentrate on the diversity of a species. So, for example, if we were talking about sorghum, there are 40,000 accessions of sorghum, and within that, they come from different parts of sorghum. The center of origin of sorghum is in Africa, so we would have crop wild relatives or wild relatives of sorghum, as well as bred cultivars. So it's a combination of elite genetic lines and wild genetic lines, and there are 40,000 of them. So it's quite a diverse collection.
Wow, 40,000. That is a lot.
And counting.
Peter, Anna, anything to add there?
I wanted to say something about the climate change affecting also the wild populations that we have today, and the gene banks have an important role to conserve also these wild species, whether they are crop wild relatives or not. And we know that they are becoming increasingly threatened, and some populations we know that they are only occurring in gene banks today. So it's very important to have a backup. And there's a lot in gene banks, but there's also a potential to increase the amount or the number of accessions that we conserve.
Awesome. Peter?
Yeah, so there is some evidence that the thousands of locally adapted varieties that are grown by small farmers and then have been grown through generation, that they are less and less planted. So there is a need to find a way to conserve this genetic diversity that can be useful in the future. There may be one single trait that we don't know we're gonna use in the future. So that's one example that is often cited. And as mentioned, for example, in the case of sorghum, the example that made Christina Walters. So you have land races from all the area where has been grown, collected across decades. Some of them may not be anymore planted, but they are in gene banks, and so their diversity is conserved to be used by plant breeders. And also you have the cases where, for example, for some native potatoes, you have cases where they've been repatriated in their in the places where they were originally collected, because the people that were cultivated at the time they were collected lost them, and some of them were repatriated. So that there are a lot of examples of wise gene banks are useful in conserving genetic diversity.
Awesome. Well, Peter, in your previous answer, you had mentioned natural disasters. So we actually got another audience question regarding natural disasters. So as we see more wildfires globally, what role do seed banks play in recovery and regrowth efforts in the regions following a fire? Anyone can feel free to start this.
I suppose if you can multiply seeds in enough number, you can support the restoration projects. Anyway, there are also places where fire is a natural part of the ecology, so it depends. It depends by the case, but that's one possibility that you can support restoration. That will be especially seed banks that are structured to multiply a large number of seeds.
Interesting. Anna, Christina, yeah? Go ahead.
Yeah, seeds wildfires are a part of our existence now in the Pacific Basin and in the West. And there is an active program. It's called the Seeds of Success program, which is a combination of land managers, federal, and as well as NGOs like botanic gardens that are collecting seeds from wild populations, and then they're stored here. Right now, there over 20,000 accessions of wild seeds. And the charter for the Seeds of Success program, which is called SOS, is to ensure that restoration of U.S. lands use these native seeds, because there's the belief that we can stop some of this constant fire cycle by, as well as ensure other ecological stability by using these wild samples or these wild populations that are native to the United States.
Wow, that's very interesting. I didn't even know that that was part of the restoration efforts. Anna, anything to add?
Yeah, I just want to say the same thing a little bit, that there's a great potential in gene banks to store seeds that can be used in restoration programs. And I think it's important to use local seeds that are locally adapted, not import from some other area where they might not be as well adapted to the environment. And there's a lot of potential for the seed banks to provide seeds for restoration projects.
Awesome. Well, I think we have time for one more question. And we have touched upon this, but maybe we could dive a little bit deeper. Christina, I'll start this one with you. Seeds. You touched on that they're not all stored the same way. So they do require some different tools. Could you tell us a little bit more about how the different seeds need to be stored?
Sure. Well, it makes life a lot easier if we can find a single way to store the seeds and then look at the response of the seeds. And usually that's in terms of what we would call the longevity, or how long they stay alive, their expiration date. All of those ways of analyzing it are valid. But typical conventional storage is storing seeds at, well, 0 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 20 degrees centigrade. And before that, we optimize the moisture. And that, in Fort Collins, that's one of the reasons why NLGRP is here, is that our moisture level, the low humidity and the thin air, is ideal for storing seeds. So we can adjust moisture for these orthodox seeds almost passively. For the other types of seeds, we'll want to adjust the moisture so we can balance the amount of water, and then how you would cryopreserve them. So we would cool them really fast to avoid water crystallization. And that it goes into optimizing it for a particular species or even for a particular accession, and it gets to be a lot more work. As Anna said, those are more expensive to work with. So we would like to have a single protocol.
Interesting. Anna, Peter, anything to add?
Yeah, and maybe also as previously mentioned, when we are talking about conserving crops, also we also conserve crop diversity in other forms. So when it's possible in seeds, because it's very practical and cheap, and so if it works, usually it's one of the preferred way. But then you have some crops that you actually conserve them as in vitro, as small plantlets. So in some cases you have field collections. So for example, for coffee, International Coffee Collection has rows of plants of different accessions growing in the same fields. So these are some example of different possibilities that you have to conserve plant crop diversity, or in some cases also wild plant diversity.
Interesting. Anna?
Yeah, I agree with the previous speakers that you can do a lot of adaptation and so on if you don't have orthodox seeds. But maybe we should mention that the majority of seeds stored in seed banks are orthodox, and in general, people follow the guidelines developed by FIO. And I think Christina described them pretty well, that you dry the seeds and you have them in about -18, -20, and in airtight containers and so on. And the great majority of seeds stored in gene banks today are stored in the sort of generally the same conditions for long-term storage.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Peter, Anna, and Christina, for joining us today and sharing your knowledge on Seed Speaks this week. I really enjoyed learning from all of you and being able to share this information as well as your expertise with our audience. Next week on Seed Speaks, join Mark to learn about precision agriculture and weather mitigation. Have a great day, and thank you again for tuning into Seed Speaks.